Okay, this might seem like a stretch. No, this band is not industrial by any stretch of the imagination, but I would argue that they are electronic, at least on this album. This is a real slab of 80s synth goodness, folks. This is one that sent me searching for more of this sound. And I would argue that they're alternative in a sense, and maybe they're alternative along a completely different axis than usual, something at 90 degrees to what we normally consider alternative. But at this point in their career, in 1984, they were probably alternative to alternative, if you know what I mean. And in my history, they're probably my first encounter with a so-called cult band. It was probably the first band for me that when I began listening to them, I really began to feel like I was in an exclusive club, and I began to identify with them in a big way. And in some ways, this band is responsible for shaping me into who I was as a young teenager and well into my adult life. Of course, I was late to the party, even back in the day. These guys were already legends by that time, having released nearly a dozen albums before I came across them. They already had a back catalog that was 4 times deeper than most bands that I had listened to. So there was a lot to dig into. And to me, even to this day, they sit on the far end of many scales. They're outliers for their musicianship, for their artistry, for their virtuosity, for their longevity, and for never compromising or diminishing their art in over 40 years. Of course, each member of this band is legendary in their own right. Alex Lifeson, the guitar virtuoso, Geddy Lee, the bass virtuoso, and just a unique, extraordinary singer, and of course, the professor, Neil Peart, R.I.P. In my opinion, and in the opinion of many others, simply the greatest rock drummer who's ever lived. And it still pains me that he's gone 3 years later. Of course, I am talking about the incomparable Rush. Maybe the greatest thing to come out of Canada, though there is something to be said for ice hockey, maple syrup, moose, and skinny puppy. I could have probably chosen any one of their 24 amazing albums, but here I'm going to talk about their 1984 album, Grace Under Pressure. Okay, so, and I realize they don't fit the mold of this show perfectly, but I would argue that they cast a very long shadow over rock music in general. Some of the key bands of the 80s and 90s have professed a love for Rush, a respect, an admiration. All you have to do is watch the documentary Beyond the Lighted Stage, which is incredibly funny and interesting, I would say, even for non-fans of the band, to just get an understanding for what kind of influence they've had. Their impact just can't be underestimated. For instance, this documentary has Trent Reznor testifying that the album Signals showed him how to incorporate keyboards into rock music. And there are about 24 other prominent musicians that speak about their love for Rush and the influence they've had. Jack Black and Billy Corgan spring to mind. Jack Black is hilarious as ever in here and is probably worth the price of admission alone. But I would say Rush might be the world's biggest cult band. And in that sense, they've always been alternative, alternative to something, alternative to mainstream rock, or maybe the mainstream music business, maybe mainstream culture in general. So in my mind, they do belong in this show. And ultimately, it's my show and I decide. So if you don't dig it, too bad. So let me talk about first hearing Rush. My first memory of them was in elementary school. So I had an art class. You remember those art classes back when they taught art in schools? My art teacher was a pretty hip guy. He let us kids bring in music to listen to while we did our thing. And of course, it was the prehistoric age when music was etched onto vinyl discs, that were about yay big. A classmate of mine brought in this album that had a pretty striking red and black cover with a photo of some sort on the front. And that's literally all I remember from that. I don't have an impression of what the music sounded like or anything. I just remembered this interesting album cover and the name of the band, which was Rush. And of course, the album was Moving Pictures, which had just come out around that time. This classmate would become a really good friend of mine and would prove to be a reliable resource for getting more Rush music and more Rush info in my future. But my next memories of them were a few years later. I'm thinking maybe in middle school, and I honestly can't remember what happened first, but it was some combination of stumbling over a live concert of theirs on public access TV one night and first hearing their album Power Windows, which came out in 1985. And I'm going with the live concert thing happening first. So, as usual, I was bumming around late one night, flipping through the TV. This must have been late after my parents had gone to bed. They were, of course, pretty cool and privileged because they had cable TV in their bedroom. So I must have had the downstairs TV all to myself. And as usual, I was exploring the upper end of the dial. I would say I was clicking around, but this was in the dark days before cordless remote controls, kids. So we literally had a channel changer box which was wired to the TV, and it had this little slider, and you would slide the little slide to whatever channel you wanted between like 2 and 40. There were only 40 channels. Can you imagine that? And it's strange because I can still remember that the Weather Channel was 14 and MTV was 27 all these years later. But those upper channels got pretty strange, and some were just digital text that displayed ads with kind of corny elevator music over them. Others were this foreign language stuff that made no sense to me. There was like home shopping crap, very early home shopping. And sometimes you just had your public access channels where people would rent TV time to cheaply talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. And if any of you are familiar with the movie and skits for Wayne's World, you kind of know what I'm talking about there. So it was weird times. This was in the mid-'80s. So I must have stumbled on one of those, and I guess someone was rebroadcasting a rock concert. And as a young, burgeoning music fan, this grabbed my attention. And I saw right away that this band had 3 dudes who were making a lot of noise. The picture was all kind of washed out. Someone had smeared Vaseline over the lens. But the music rocked, and I didn't know any of the tunes, but there must have been a bumper or commercial or something that told me what I was watching. And it turns out it was Rush's Grace Under Pressure video. And I remember running to the newspaper. Newspapers, those used to be a thing. And it was this thing that, printed words on paper. And it would arrive at our house every day. And somewhere in the depths of that newspaper was an entire page with a big chart on it that showed what was playing on every one of those 40-some channels throughout the day. And I consulted that and saw, sure enough, they were going to replay the concert later that night, as they often did. They would repeat programming because, if you can believe it, there wasn't enough programming for an entire 24-hour period. They would repeat things. So I queued up my old video cassette recorder, or VCR for short, and I taped it. And I was so proud that I had my own copy of that show, and I must have watched it over and over and over 1,000 times until I had every moment memorized. But a couple of things happened after that. A friend came over one night while I was watching it and said, "Oh, Rush." He knew them immediately, which was impressive. "I like their one song," he said. The one that goes, the world is. And I had no idea what the hell he was talking about. All I knew were the songs on this video. I didn't actually own any Rush music yet. But eventually he remembered and said, "Yeah, it's called Tom Sawyer. Do they play that?" And I said no, because I didn't remember any song that went like that. But then I remember carefully scrutinizing the credits at the end, and I noticed that they listed all of the songs that were played and that Tom Sawyer was there. So what the heck was going on? And me being the nerd I am, I made a list of all the songs, And I went back and checked off the ones that I actually had in my recording, and it turns out I was missing a bunch. And that's the way it was, folks, when you pirated content directly off the TV. Not only was your recording full of annoying commercial breaks, but they would edit the material down to fit into the single hour. Anyway, so I found it just magical to watch these guys perform live. I couldn't believe how good they were, how tight they were as musicians, how inventive the songs were. And I couldn't believe that Geddy Lee was doing as much as he was doing on stage. He was singing, playing bass, and playing keyboards just seamlessly. They were obviously great musicians. It was really impressive. They just played the songs that were really complex. They played them effortlessly. But that all didn't appeal to me as much as the songs themselves. They really rocked and they were catchy. And that was the important thing to me. Soon enough, I would go hunting for friends who had Rush that I could either borrow or copy. And I guess right around that time, Power Windows came out, which was the latest and greatest studio album around that time. I don't remember waiting for it to come out, so it must have come out, and then later I was aware of it. Somebody just showed up with it one day. But that was probably the first studio album of theirs that I listened to. And to this day, it holds a special place of honor in my heart, in my mind. But little did I know that I was catching the Rush wave right in the midst of their controversial synth period. So that lasted from about 1982 to 1987, around between Signals and Hold Your Fire. And what was going on was that frontman and bassist Geddy Lee would get deeper and deeper into keyboards and synths. And that was the tendency of the time. Clearly, right around that time in the 80s, all of that technology was coming to the fore. You know, they were coming out with newer and better synthesizers and sequencers and MIDI and all that fun stuff. And Geddy was a tech head. He was fascinated by that. Alex less so. I think Neil was probably pretty on the fence with it all, but it would certainly drive Rush in that musical direction for that period of time. And it would prove to be a divisive thing. Even Alex would eventually push back and argue for more straight-up rock. But since these were my formative years, I would fall firmly into camp synth. That's, I know, probably gonna irritate some Rush fans there, but that's where I am. The Rush albums of the 80s are absolutely my favorites, and it's probably because I caught that concert video on TV one night. Because I caught that video on TV one night, that Grace Under Pressure is my favorite of all of those synth albums. But I should also throw some credit here to a most awesome uncle of mine. He was 11 years older than I was, and he still is. He is a Rush fiend, and back in the day when he caught wind that his nephew sort of liked Rush, suddenly this care package showed up on my front door, and it was full of tapes that he made of all of his Rush CDs, basically his whole collection, with photocopies of all the liner notes and lyrics. And they weren't just cheap tapes either. These were like type 2s or metals. I mean, if you're of a certain age, you know what I'm talking about. So he was crucial in supporting my early Rush needs. So if you're listening, thanks, Uncle C. I really appreciate it. Of course, I'd go on to purchase and repurchase their entire catalog many times in many different formats over the years. Thank you, record industry. So it wasn't just about pirating those. I really don't listen to cassettes anymore, kids, even though I understand they're making a very strange comeback of sorts these days. So let's talk about Grace Under Pressure specifically. This is Rush's 10th studio album, and they released it in 1984. My CD here is the remastered version. I'm not sure when this came out, but this, like I said, is really the second of their extremely synthy albums. The first was Signals, which came out in 1982. And it's funny to think that for a while there, they were coming out with a new album every other year. They were really on this cadence that's hard to imagine now. But that's the way it is and was for bands in their prime. And maybe that's how you know you're in your prime. If you're able to write a killer album every other year, then you're in your prime. Anyway, this cover art was a painting by their longtime collaborator, Hugh Syme, and it's kind of an abstract piece, but it's probably my favorite Rush cover ever. I don't know why. It just really created an impression on me as a kid. And it might be another reason alone why this is my favorite album. But there are a few Easter eggs here, as there usually were. There is a little P over G symbol here on the right. Grace under pressure, get it? I'm sure thousands of people have that as a tattoo. There's also an eagle's eye hidden up here in the top bit. So the back cover to the album, which is inside the CD here, is this cool black and white photo of the band, which I think was a first for them. And as usual, there are full liner notes with lyrics and credits and all sorts of funny messages. And this great visual pun. Hugh Syme often put some very literal visual puns in the album art. Grace under pressure, the egg in the C-clamp. Anyway, I think this was the first album they did without their longtime producer and friend Terry Brown. I think they had a guy named Peter Henderson, come in. And I understand the band ended up producing really most of the tracks themselves. So let's talk about Grace Under Pressure track by track. It's funny to think there are only 8 songs on this album. And again, back in the day, albums were really limited by the vinyl format. You could only have an album that was 40 or so minutes. Otherwise, it wouldn't fit on a single vinyl record. So you had these 8-track albums, which by today's standards are considered kind of short. But this album starts off with Distant Early Warning, just a great opener, one of their classic live tracks. To me, this song summarizes this entire period for them in the same way that Subdivisions did on Signals. They were both opening tunes. Both tunes have a pretty similar blend of synth and guitar, and both are completely iconic. Of course, the meaning of it, the Distant Early Warning line, it was a series of radar stations in Canada that back in the day were meant to alert the West of a Soviet nuclear attack. So what an uplifting way to start the album. But, remember, this was in the depths of the Cold War, and this song has actually has a cool video of a kid riding a missile, just like Slim Pickens in Dr. Strangelove. So that goes into After Image, which is another great, memorable tune where the guitar and the keyboards, in my mind, fit seamlessly. Like great synth work from Geddy. It's a song about death, but it's actually pretty upbeat, which kind of fits with the overall theme of this album, which obviously is holding up under adversity. Then we have the third track, Red Sector A. This tune immediately jumped out at me when I was watching the concert video, maybe because of the really cool laser show that they had synced to the lyrics and the rhythm, but more likely because it had a disco beat and cool hooks, and I was always a sucker for a cool disco beat. This might be the danciest song ever about a concentration camp. So, great tune, classic tune, fan favorite for sure. That goes into the fourth track, which is The Enemy Within. This is actually a great tune that I didn't appreciate as much back in the days when I had this on cassette. But wow, what a tune. I mean, they really belted out in that concert video as well. They just do a great version of this. And I love the line about impossible dreams experienced to extremes. I should point out that this is part 1 of Fear, which is a set of songs that all had to do with fear. And anyway, there's a great outro in this song too, with like a really funky bass line that they just jam out. That goes into the 5th track, The Body Electric. This is one of those rare songs that just has such an unusual rhythm that you have to wonder why every other band didn't do their own version of it, just copy it. But as it is, as far as I know, it's pretty unique. The lyrics are right out of a Philip K. Dick novel, though the title itself is from a Walt Whitman quote. The video for this song is very 80s. I think you should check it out. And I seem to remember watching that video back in music class, back in middle school, for some strange reason. I don't know. That goes into Kid Gloves. All right. This is one of my favorite songs on this record. It's just a phenomenal pop song. And yeah, it has an unusual time signature, but who cares when it rocks that hard? I mean, you can say that about most Rush songs, really. But yeah, the virtuosity here is an interesting side note. But I think the fact is that most people probably aren't even conscious of all the crazy time and key changes, because all of that stuff is secondary to the song being so awesome. And with Rush, that's really the key. It's never the case that they're showing off in a song just to show off. I mean, it's always in service to the song, maybe with the exception of Neil's drum solos on the live albums. But, you know, what the hell? It's the greatest drummer in the world, and we all want to see him do his thing, right? But anyway, Kid Gloves, I love this song. Red Lenses is a tune that's sort of like Anagram for Mongo and Presto, in that it has a lot of wordplay in it. And I like this mostly because I like almost any song that has a funky bass line over groovy drums. So that's really what I dig about this. And the keyboard bits are kind of jarring here in a nice way. It's almost like they were very different. They wanted something very different from the regular verse. But it's a cool track, and it's unusual because the lyrics are printed in red within here, so that's a nice touch. Just a lot of puns on the meaning of red, the color red, etc., all kind of jammed into one song. Then it winds up with Between the Wheels. I have to admit this is probably my least favorite track on here because it's sort of like atonal sludge rock. I guess it's nice for contrast. And reading Neil's write-up about the recording of this album, it sounds like it might have been the very first thing they recorded for this album. But yeah, if you don't know, Neil would write up a little diary as they were doing the writing and recording of each album, and those diaries would end up going into the tour booklet that you could purchase whenever you'd go see them live. So more on that in a bit, though. Let's talk about the concert video. So I actually picked this up a while back in the form of this Replay x3 package that bundled up all the videos for Exit Stage Left, Grace Under Pressure, and A Show of Hands. Here's the egg and the C-clamp again, A Show of Hands, and Exit Stage Left. So there we go. And of course, all of these videos are all over YouTube, but I have the DVDs for the same reason I have CDs, because YouTube has crappy quality, frankly, and you never know if it's going to be there tomorrow. And I like to own the thing myself. I like it to be DRM free. I want full audio and video quality. And if you get the DVD, you don't have to put up with stupid YouTube ads or MPEG compression. This package is also really cool because it does come with the, let me show you. It comes with a CD of the live show, which I'm not going to be able to get out of here very easily. So this is a CD audio of the Grace Under Pressure live show, along with a DVD of the actual video. That's really cool. And it also comes with these tour booklets I was telling you about, where you can read Neil's write-up of how they recorded and wrote the album. And this is the entire tour booklet here. And there's one of these for Grace Under Pressure, one for Exit Stage Left, and one for A Show of Hands, which is really cool. So there's something about this show that I really like too, and it's strange, but it's actually this font that Hugh Syme uses for the album. I think it's a really cool font, and on the video there's this whole intro piece where the band name floats in out of space like very slowly, and then the name of the show appears over it. And I don't know, that just made a huge impression on me as a kid. It just was really cool. And the show starts with them playing the Three Blind Mice intro, which was always funny, and I don't know that I fully got that as a kid. But then they launch right into The Spirit of Radio, which might be my favorite Rush song ever. It's hard to say because, there are just so many. It goes from The Spirit of Radio to The Enemy Within, which is a good 1-2 punch. Again, they do a great job on that. They lead into The Weapon from Signals, which has this really strange segment featuring Count Floyd, who I guess was a character on Canadian television at the time, but he encourages everyone in the audience to put on 3D glasses, which is always trippy to see when you're not one wearing the 3D glasses. And I guess there were some very special effects for them in the audience at that time. But The Weapon's a really cool kind of electronic, sort of hypnotic song. I dig it. Goes into Witch Hunt, which is a classic track from Moving Pictures. Then New World Man, which is kind of a pop tune from Signals. Then they get back into Distant Early Warning and Red Sector A from Grace Under Pressure. They play Closer to the Heart, which dips way back into the catalog. Then there's a medley that's pretty hard to top, where they play YYZ leading into 2112's The Temples of Syrinx, leading into Tom Sawyer. So that one was definitely not on my VHS tape, which was a real shame. I couldn't appreciate that until much later when I had this copy of my own and could watch the whole thing, or when I could see it on YouTube. Then they play Vital Signs, which is another signature tune from Moving Pictures. And then they wind it all up with another medley going way back to the first album, Finding My Way into In the Mood. And that must have been the encore just to satisfy those hardcore fans in the audience who loved them way back when in 1973. But just a fantastic set, and it's really fun to watch these guys rock it out. They're young, they have all the energy in the world. It's just a fantastic show. Alex got the skater hair going. Geddy has that longish 80s hair and like a tweed sport coat. Neil has a rat tail. So yeah, very 80s. And it's just amazing to watch them at their at like peak energy. Everything was just so effortless for them when they're playing. You could see them multitasking, and the foot pedals that Alex and Geddy use, and just lots of instrument switching and bouncing around. And it's always a wonder to watch these three guys make such a glorious racket. So why do I love this album? Well, it's not just the album, folks. I mean, first and foremost, I love this band. I mean, they're in my top 3 bands of all time. I mean, in any way you would want to measure it, by albums owned, number of hours I've listened to them, the effort I've put into following them over the years, whatever. I mean, these guys changed my life. And again, if you haven't seen it, check out this documentary, Beyond the Lighted Stage. It explains Rush fandom better than I ever can. And I can't imagine that anybody could watch this without becoming something of a Rush fan themselves. But I think seeing that Grace Under Pressure concert probably gave me a connection to this album that was very special. I can watch that concert just about any time, and suddenly I'm getting back into Rush. I'm listening to all the other albums and just getting into them in a big way. And I did mention that Power Windows, which came out right after this album, it's the next album out, was probably the first studio album of theirs that I owned. But I have to say I prefer the songs on Grace Under Pressure. They just rock more. And to me, to my ears, even now, Power Windows seems a bit polished, maybe a bit too much like a creation of the studio. Whereas Grace Under Pressure, kind of like Signals, it has some dirty edges. Neil doesn't sound quite as much like a drum machine here. And Alex is just throwing down some really great guitar. And I have to address this. I know I preach the gospel in this show of less is more in music. And I like to spend a lot of time saying how even mediocre musicians can make compelling music. So why am I out here pimping Rush? I mean, these guys are musicians. Their skills, however you want to measure them, are world class. I would put them up against Frank Zappa and his band any day. Frankly, see what I did there? I mean, name the technically awesome musician of your choice, whoever they are, and Rush is in that same category with them easily. So what is the deal? And I said it before, and I'll say it again. Everything Rush did was in service to the song. So if the song needed a tempo change or a time signature change or a key change, that's what they did, and they did it effortlessly. They weren't throwing that stuff in there to show off or just to try to spice up an otherwise boring musical idea. It actually went in the other direction, and to me, that was critical. So the song was driving what they did, not the other way around. These guys were not like some cliched prog rock guy who was just seeing what sort of music he could make if he imposed a bunch of crazy rules, or if he treated his piano, or if he ignored the diatonic scale or something nutty like that. They weren't experimenting. So with Rush, it was always the song that came first, and they did what they had to do to make the song work. It just so happened that sometimes they had to do things no one ever thought of or that no one else could do. I mean, so I've watched all the concerts that Alex and Geddy have played in the past couple years with a variety of people sitting in for Neil. And with all due respect to Dave Grohl and Danny Carey and Tim Alexander and Chad Smith and all the other guys they played with recently, who are all phenomenal drummers, none of those folks could quite do what Neil did. I mean, Neil was unique. He was in a class of his own. And I am positive the same thing is true for Alex and Geddy. I mean, what can you say? They had a deep well of talent to draw from. But yeah, again, they only used that talent in service to the songs. And I can think of no better example than the song Free Will. Do you think that someone listening to that song on their car radio is even aware of all the technical stuff going on? That's crazy. Like, try counting that song as you're listening to it, and you'll quickly get lost. It's insane. For an ordinary musician, it makes the song damn near unplayable. But the magic of Rush is that you don't even notice it when you're listening to it. You're just hearing a badass rock song, and you don't even realize that all that stuff is going on. And to me, that's why Rush is the best at what they do. That virtuoso stuff is right there, but you don't notice it. And it's like a magic trick. It really is. So where are they now? After Grace Under Pressure, they'd go on to record 9 more studio albums over the next 30 years. What is totally nuts is that, for the most part, each album was as good as or better than the last. And it's amazing to me that Rush never jumped the shark. They were pushing themselves as musicians right up to the very end. Their final album was Clockwork Angels, which they released in 2012. And it's hard for me to believe that that was already more than 10 years ago. It was the concept album to end all concept albums. And to me, it sounded as fresh and vital as anything they ever recorded. It was clear they still had plenty of ideas. They toured that album with a string section, which is something they'd never done before. And they were really pushing themselves. And I'm glad to say I caught that concert when they rolled through town. We had no way of knowing it would really be their last studio album. So Rush as a band ended when Neil passed away in 2020. He is gone. but he has left an indelible mark on history. And Getty and Alex, like I said, are still out there playing. God bless them. Alex even has a new project called Envy of None that is very unlike Rush, but it is awesome. He said in an interview he was inspired to play guitar that didn't sound like guitar, and I have to agree with that description. So check it out, Envy of None. And there you have it, kids. So one of the greatest bands ever, Rush, and one of their greatest albums ever, Grace Under Pressure. So if you enjoyed this, stick around. I have plenty more 80s and 90s albums to talk about. This show is called Stronger Than Reason. It's available on YouTube and as a podcast, wherever you do the podcast thing. If you like what you heard, please do what they say. Like and subscribe. It helps other people find the show. Just want to remind you that I am only one guy with an opinion. So please consider leaving yours as a comment. And if you made it this far, thank you for listening. And until next time, stay strong.